Hey, and welcome to a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I'm Ron Coddington, the editor and publisher of Military Images. My story today begins actually a few days ago. On Monday, I had the honor and privilege to do a talk about Civil War photography in Alexandria, Virginia. And it's a talk that I've given a few times in the past. And each time I add new information depending upon what I'm researching and how the audience is reacting. And so over the last couple of days, I've received emails and messages on Facebook and elsewhere, very nice compliments about the talk. And what's unique about the talk is that I really discuss the sort of basics of Civil War photography, answering the question, why did they pose the way they did? That's a big part of the talk. And part of the reason that they posed the way they did, part of the reason you see what you see when you look at a photograph of a Confederate or a Union soldier, is because of how the photographers were trained. One of those photographers, a Pennsylvanian named Marcus Aurelius Root, wrote a handbook in 1864. The handbook was geared towards photographers, teaching them the basics of the craft. It has the fanciful name, the camera and the pencil. And so Root, inside this large tome, and I should say it's a 19th century handbook, so it's really dense and it has a lot of heavy Victorian language in it. Buried in that tome is 6 tips for an artful Civil War portrait. And you should know that Root considered himself to be as much an artist as a photographer. And so this 6 tips is something that I was able to pull out of the book. And it was no easy task because the language of the time, it's really rather dense. So I found those 6 tips and I've used those in a number of presentations. And it never fails that folks respond to these particular 6 tips. So based on the enthusiasm of the crowd, I thought, you know what, I should probably share those tips with all of you. So if you're ready, I'm going to give you 6 tips from Marcus Aurelius Root, the Philadelphia photographer, and he is in his handbook, he's talking to his fellow photographers. So here's what he is telling photographers those 6 important tips are to make the best photograph possible. So here we go. The first one, the figure should be off center. Look at this image here of a Union soldier. He's certainly not in the center. And the reason for that is if you have someone in the center, you sort of, the symmetry sort of doesn't become quite as visually interesting. So put that figure off center. Here's the second tip. The distance between the lens and the figure should be greater than the figure and the backdrop. So here's a good example of this. It just, when you have more distance between the camera and the figure, then the image looks bigger, it looks more expansive. And if you look at this soldier, you can see his heels are literally against the backdrop behind him. Ready for the third tip? Here it is. The distance between the top and the bottom of the figure should not be equal. This carte de visite of a young man with his gun is a perfect example. There's only a little bit of space below his feet and the bottom of the frame and his cap and the top of the frame. Why is this, you may ask? Well, it makes the figure look taller, and people like to look taller. Now, the fourth tip is this one. The figure should be composed in an engaging manner. Look at this young man. He is looking off to the side. He has his hand, his arm resting over the side of a chair. His cap is at a jaunty tilt, and he's looking away from the camera. it just looks visually interesting. He's not at all symmetric. He's at a slight angle. So it has that quality to it. Tip number 5, the figure should be lit at a 45-degree angle. If you look at this Confederate soldier, you'll see that the light is coming down and half of his face is lit. The other half is in shadow. It gives him a 3-dimensional quality, a lifelike quality. It looks more authentically like a human being. So that's the importance of light. The 6th and final tip is this one. If all else fails, keep it simple. Don't have a lot of busyness going on. And this Union soldier is an example of that. He's posed here in a very documentary way. He has his equipment. He has his gun. There's no ostentatious display about it. It is simply who he is, again, in a very documentary type format. So that's Marcus Aurelius Root, his 6 tips for a better portrait. So the next time you're looking at a Civil War portrait photograph, whether it is an ambrotype, a tintype, possibly a daguerreotype, a carte de visite, or another albumen print, think about Root's 6 tips. And I think it will help you get a better understanding of what you're looking at, of the soldier or the sailor or the civilian you see. Think about when they're in the studio. Think about the photographer giving them direction, or at least thinking about how to pose that person to the best advantage. The last thing I'll add is the photographer was doing it to not only create a better experience for the sitter, he was also doing it, or she was also doing it, because they wanted to have that photograph look great, because they wanted to have that sitter be a return customer, and they wanted to get some cash at the end of the day. They wanted a satisfied customer. So there it is, Marcus Aurelius Root's 6 tips for an artful portrait. Thank you very much for tuning in. And until the next video, happy trails.